Bookseller Crow on the box. Tales from an empty bookshop.
Action!
Hello and welcome to the latest in our talks from an empty bookshop. This evening we welcome Nick Pettigrew, author of the very funny but also an indictment of our current times, I think, Antisocial, the secret diary of an antisocial behaviour officer. We're filming this interview with Nick on the day that the shop's been broken into in the early hours of the morning.
I mean, the lengths I'll go to for publicity.
It's cut.
You want me to cut?
Yeah,
Why?
because I forgot to ask Nick something. So normally, Nick, we would have a sea of faces looking at us rather than
A sea of books.
a sea of books. Yes, but and normally what people do first is read a bit. So
Yep.
if you're happy to do that, that would
Yeah,
be really
no,
good.
absolutely.
Yeah.
So I had to read the audio book out, which was a bit daunting as well. So hopefully I've learned a few sort of lessons from that. Okay, so 11th of March. Ashley wants to transfer to another house because he doesn't feel safe in his current property. A few months ago, 4 masked men burst into his home and set about him with metal pipes. His injuries required hospital treatment, and he's worried they could come back again at any time. He was good enough to provide photographs taken at the time of his injuries, and sure enough, they were pretty serious. He looked like somebody mistook him for a piñata. As always in cases like these, I submitted an information request to the police to verify his claims and to try and put into context what happened. Coincidentally, Ashley's neighbours had previously made complaints of multiple visitors coming and going from Ashley's address, as well as a strong smell of cannabis. Based on the initial evidence, my guess was that Ashley either had drugs that the masked men would much have preferred to have instead, or that Ashley had taken possession of drugs that didn't belong to him and the masked men rather wanted back. My cynicism was misplaced in this instance, though. Ashley didn't deal drugs, and it was wrong of me to suspect that he did. He did beat up his partner. His criminal record shows a non-molestation order from his now ex-partner following a series of incidents. Ashley used to live with his partner and her only son, Hamish, who was in his late teens. After a prolonged spell of domestic abuse witnessed by Hamish, she managed to get away from Ashley and get a court order to keep him away. Ashley had decided to ignore this court order and pay her a further visit so he could threaten her some more. Now, Hamish hatched a cunning plan to teach Ashley a lesson. He and his 3 friends would wear balaclavas, break into Ashley's house and give him a hiding. The fact Hamish is due in court shortly for the assault showed the nobody will know it's us part of his plan had somehow backfired. So, what gave Hamish away? Fingerprints? No. A telltale shoe print in Ashley's blood? No. A painstaking search of Ashley's flat, producing a set of fibres matching Hamish's balaclava, which was only sold in one particular shop near to Hamish's home? No, not that either. Hamish came to the police's attention because, while he and his friends were beating Ashley up, he'd repeatedly shouted, "Leave my fucking mum alone." Ashley is granted his place on the transfer list so he can start bidding for a place where Hamish can't find him again and can't carry out any more fiendishly brilliant acts of violence.
Reading your book, I'm in awe of the fact that you could even do it for a month, let alone for 18 years, was it?
It was 15 years.
15
yeah.
years.
It felt like 18, but yeah. I mean, I'd always say it's one of those jobs you do for 6 weeks and then never touch again because it's horrible, or you kind of get a taste for it and then you end up doing it for years. I mean, I had colleagues who'd done it longer even than me. I'd had people who've been doing it for 20 years and more. So I think it is a job you can either do or you can't.
I was very taken by there's a part where you're on holiday and you're describing what you do to a couple, and the guy says, "Are there any mental health provisions, and you start talking about what there is, and he says, "No, I meant for you."
Yeah. It never really occurred to me that that's what he was referring to. Yeah.
Because I mean, there is, but you do, as the months go by in the book, you do sort of catalogue your own kind of reactions and the amount of stress that you're under. And,
I mean, I felt it was. I thought it was honest to do that. I think it'd only be telling half the story if I just talked about the people I was dealing with. I think it felt like the right thing to do to sort of try and show the impact the job was having on me. The most obvious one, the medication I was taking and the steadily increasing dosage of it, as well as sadly other medication I was taking and increased dosages of that as well. So it was a conscious decision, because I wanted to try and get across that this is a job that can have consequences.
Sure. And the things that you were dealing with, one of the most overriding or kind of overarching things is drugs. They seem all pervasive and everywhere in it. Which was, in a way, kind of surprising to me, because obviously everybody knows that there's tons of drug dealing going on, but it just seemed to be a kind of bedrock of the kind of problems that you were dealing with.
I mean, I think people with chaotic lifestyles, and they tend to be the people that cause the antisocial behaviour. It tends to be a part of their life. I don't think certainly in my experience, I didn't meet many people who, were a barrister and had a wife and kids and a loving family, didn't wake up one morning and decide, right, I'm going to start verbally abusing my neighbours, or playing music at 3 a.m. So it tends to be part and parcel of it, and the more I think about it and the people that I dealt with, the antisocial behaviour itself is almost like the fire alarm going off. It's not the fire itself, if that makes sense.
Sure.
So that when they came to our attention, it was because they were kicking off and causing havoc for the neighbours, or drug dealing in the streets or stuff like that. But that's kind of a symptom rather than the cause, and the symptoms are, the cause rather is the chaotic lifestyle, and that often is drugs, whether they are addicts themselves or they are selling drugs, which again, drug dealers don't tend to make the best neighbours. Although there was one drug dealer that I dealt with, which isn't in the book. It was really odd. We had a very chaotic, antisocial guy who lived in a flat, and he was always shouting at his neighbours and so on. And suddenly he just stopped. He stopped. We didn't hear anything from him. He was, we weren't dealing with him. And this went on for months. We thought, well, he must have started behaving himself again. His rent started getting paid as well. He was always in debt with his rent, and that stopped as well. We thought, well, maybe he's turned his life around. It can happen. And it was only when one of the elderly tenants in the block said, oh, there's 2 new lads who live in the flat. They're really nice. They help me with my shopping. They're always really polite and so on. So that sort of rang an alarm bell, because we knew somebody else hadn't moved in. And one thing led to another, and it turned out there were 2 crack dealers living in this flat. And what they'd done is they met our chaotic neighbour in a pub and had basically offered him, here's some money to give us the keys to your flat and go away. And because he was quite chaotic, he said yes. So they moved in, and they were one of the few drug dealers we ever dealt with that just kept a low profile, kept the flat in good repair. I mean, it was funny when the police visited the flat and broke in, and I was there with them. I walked in, and the flat was nicer than my flat. It was you could eat the dinner off the floor. It was they one of the few that had the sense to just keep a very low profile, but completely the exception rather than the rule. It's usually the other way around.
And we were talking earlier, in fact, about the break-in that we had today, which most likely is drug related, because all they took was money and they weren't interested in absolutely anything else. And we were talking about the various problems that addicts would have at the moment trying to get the money to.
Yeah, I mean, I think from my experience, a lot of the people that I was dealing with were either homeless, street sleeping homeless, or were sort of indigent in some capacity. And if they had drug or alcohol, quite often both issues, obviously they had to get money to do that. And honestly, the three general ways would be either by begging, or it would be sort of petty crime like pickpocketing or shoplifting or things like that, or sex work was another common way they found to pay for their addiction. And obviously during lockdown the shops were shut. Even now that they're open, they're very heavily monitored. During lockdown, people weren't using train stations, tube stations, bus stops and all that kind of thing, and people, I would imagine, weren't visiting sex workers either. So I always feel you can live in the world that you want to exist, which is a nice world where people don't have to resort to these things and aren't addicts, or you can live in the real world with the one we live in. So that was my concern. Just these are still people. They still, have lives, and you might not wish for them to be addicts, but they are. And I don't know how they've managed. To be honest with you, I don't know how they've managed it, and whether it is a case, you mentioned the break-in, whether they've graduated to crimes that maybe they wouldn't normally consider, whether that's a possibility. Yeah.
Most of your patch was what, for want of a better term, we would call council housing or
social housing.
Social housing. Yeah. Do you think there's an extent to which that is removing the problem away from, Dulwich Village or whatever? It's keeping so that those people who live in nice houses in leafy locations will actually never really come into that.
Yeah, I mean that's.
Surely they've got antisocial behaviour as well.
They possibly do. I think the difference is with people who live in social housing. There is a responsibility of the landlord to investigate antisocial behaviour, right. Whereas with private accommodation, whether you're renting or you own, there isn't. The council can sometimes get involved, but not always. But I think that issue of the sort of separating it out and so on, I think that's becoming less and less because the demand for housing is so high, and I talk about in the book the right to buy scheme, which my own view is one of the most catastrophic housing schemes ever, because the idea was to put housing back into the hands of people on low incomes. That's not what's happened. From my experience, people who lived in social housing used the right to buy scheme to buy their properties. They waited out I think it's 5 years, you have to live in the property, you're not allowed to sell it before then. And then as soon as that was up, they would rent it out. And what you were then getting is, people privately renting without the same investment in their community, or it would get sold and it would enter the private market, and you would get people on the housing ladder. But I had a sort of estate where I managed where you had people on very low income, very deprived areas of where I was working, and the property next door to them, literally next door to them, you'd go onto Rightmove and it'd be on sale for £600,000, £750,000. But while you're getting people who are, maybe on higher incomes or what have you, living alongside people who aren't, my concern was always this idea of gentrification, that, well, it's okay because if people with income move into those areas, they'll bring money with them. They do, but it doesn't go anywhere. Because what you end up is, and this is a classic example of one of the estates I worked on, there was a greasy spoon, which was brilliant. You get like toast and tea for about £1.10. It was fantastic. And gentrification started to creep in, and that closed down, and a really lovely coffee shop opened up, which was like £3 for a cup of tea, and a mortgage for the toast. So what happened was you'd have the property owned by people who own businesses, so that's not people from the local estate. The staff weren't, they were often students and stuff like that, and the customers certainly weren't. So you get these bubbles of money existing in this wider sort of society. So even this idea that, okay, well, through gentrification you'll get a mix of people from different sort of social classes, it's still very sort of stratified. It's still very separated, I think.
You put forward, I don't mean to bang on about the drugs all the time, but you put forward a very convincing argument for essentially the legalisation of them.
I mean, legalisation's maybe is a brief way of explaining it, but essentially, I mean, and I talk about it in the book. I had a manager who'd never dealt with antisocial behaviour and was probably from somewhere like Dulwich, like you mentioned, a leaky suburb. And they came in and they said, "Well, I'm being told drug dealing is a problem on our estates. So how do we stop it?" And I was maybe a bit sarcastic, but I said, "Okay, well, what we need to do is, as ASB officers, we need to embark on a 10-year education programme of drugs, start it in schools, but have it all the way through society, that's very honest, that talks about the plus sides and downsides, doesn't try to demonise it, but at the same time not romanticise it. So after we do that, you have a gradual decriminalisation of drugs, maybe starting from the softer drugs and working harder, and then have them allowed for purchase for the softer drugs and for prescription for the harder drugs, and alongside that we have an education program and better access to education and better youth intervention and jobs for people to go to. Then you'll get drug dealing, because that's what you need. It's not a problem in isolation. But for me, the question I always ask is, and don't take this personally, have you ever smoked crack?
No.
Recently. Okay, so was the fact it was illegal the factor that stopped you from doing it?
No.
Okay, a secondary question you may not wish to answer is, have you ever taken an illegal substance? If you don't feel comfortable answering it, that's fine to not answer. When I ask people
not really.
That's fine. I'll ask people the first question, they'll say no, and then I'll ask them the secondary question, they'll say yes, because maybe they've smoked weed at college or something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
I'll ask them the same question. It's illegal. Did that stop you? No. So if the legality doesn't stop you, how's it helping? Because every single person that I dealt with that was struggling, sleeping in stairwells and causing chaos for neighbours and so on like that, the fact they never woke up one day and went, hang on, this is illegal, I better stop.
Yeah, for sure.
Do you know what I mean? So it doesn't make any difference. It criminalises what's a medical condition, which is addiction. So my argument is that if this is only based on my experience, and I don't claim to be an expert, but the heroin users and the crack addicts that I met, if they could go and get a prescription, a 2-day prescription or what have you, and it was medical grade, so it wasn't as ruinous to their health as these adulterated drugs are. If they could get a 2 or 3 day prescription, go home, take the drugs, they wouldn't bother anyone. Heroin users don't want to be out in the streets wandering around hustling for money. They just want to stay in their homes. So for me, the decriminalisation of it would stop all the crimes like you've experienced today. It would open the prisons up because a massive percentage of people in prison are for drug-related offences, or not, even if it's not drugs themselves, it's burglary, theft, things like that. So you'd empty the prisons, which there isn't, I don't think, the impetus to do in a current society, because prisons are run for profit and they need prisoners. So that's an issue. So I just think if people that were going to take drugs anyway can do it safely and not at harm to society, the people who are never going to do it in the first place still won't. I think for the softer drugs, cannabis being a really good example, you look at states in America now that cannot spend the revenue that's being generated. They can't find enough public programs to spend the revenue, because if you had that and taxed it, and again it would just remove another revenue stream from criminal gangs. Mm-hmm. So I think for me, any argument against the decriminalisation of drugs is always a moral one rather than a logical one or a practical one, to be honest with you. And what I don't understand is that, generally speaking, that it's a very right-wing argument that this shouldn't happen. I just think, well, it's a tax, it's a revenue-making scheme. From a purely capitalistic point of view, it's a good idea.
What would the criminal gangs do?
Well, that's a good question, but for me, you can't say we can't do this because the criminals will go and do something else. I think the criminals will go and do something else anyway. I think it's possible that but for me, there will be a criminal element that would look to do something else instead. But I think for the lower level, sort of street dealers, if you like, then that would go away to a greater extent because they're doing it to fund their addiction. And if, as I say, for the harder drugs, if they were getting a prescription for that, so it didn't need to be out in corners selling, because generally most of your street dealers are addicts. That's why they do it. Again, you don't get people who sort of get up and get dressed, have a shower, and then go out and do. It's really uncommon that that's the case. So I think the criminal element of it, it might still exist. I might sort of morph into something else, but I don't know that that's for me a good enough reason to say not to do it.
No, for sure. I was also quite taken by your idea of tending a cannabis factory as a lifestyle choice, in a sense. Well, as a positive lifestyle choice, but within a perspective.
I mean, I think it comes down to what your options have been. I just think, and I mention it in the book, that it's very easy to, it's like, would you ever punch anyone for a loaf of bread? No. Have you ever not eaten for 3 months? No. So, it's depends on your circumstances. And as I say in the book, if you've got no options, no money, no education, no job, no prospects, and maybe you're living alongside people who've got all those things, maybe you went to school with them, but for whatever reason that's not been your life, I think it's far too easy, and it's certain aspects of the media and the government that have this idea that moral fibre is absolute dependent regardless of your circumstances. I think if you threw your average member of the House of Lords into one of the estates I dealt with and see how long they would last without resorting to these kind of things, I just think if you're in that circumstance and you've got no prospects, and then somebody comes up to you and offers you more money than you'd see in a year, and all you have to do is sleep on your sofa because they're going to use the other rooms to grow cannabis, I don't know that I'd say no. I'm being honest. I generally don't know that I'd say no in that circumstance.
We could put Ian Botham in there, couldn't we?
Well, yes. Well, I mean, I would
probably start a vineyard though.
Well, didn't he? No, because he had, I believe, a conviction for cannabis, so he may end up sampling the products.
Actually, that's true. Well, actually, I'm sure the lawyers will vet that one.
Yes. I may be very wrong in which case.
It should also be emphasised that the book is very funny. You managed to find humour in what could be an unremittingly bleak kind of
it's gallows humour, very much so. No, I'm aware my sense of humour runs to the sort of quite jet black. It can be. I think it's if you speak to anyone who's frontline, so my brother's an A&E nurse. My mum used to work in a care home. So I think anyone who does that kind of job, who is confronted with death and chaos and awfulness, that kind of has to be the way you deal with it, because otherwise you go stark staring mad. So I think for that reason, writing the book, that felt the natural register to write it in, because that's how I dealt with it in the job. Mm-hmm. I think what I didn't want to write is one of those awful sort of hand-wringing poverty porn, misery diaries. That didn't interest me at all. I want people to enjoy reading it. So that was another reason to write it in that sort of in that way. And just I that is my natural register when I write. It's the other writing I've done in the past has been sort of comedy-ish kind of things. So it just felt the right way of doing it. But what I do hope with the book is that if there is comedy in it, it's not at the expense of anybody or the people that I deal with. The last thing I wanted to do is to make fun of anyone, and I hope that's not what's happening.
No, that doesn't come across at all. What comes across is an extraordinary empathy with people who are clearly terribly challenged a lot of the time. The other strand, or pervasive strand, really is the mental health issue, and the fact that people don't get anywhere near the proper kind of care for the kind of things that they're going through.
No. I mean, it's you know, since doing the job, I've noticed the rapid decline. I mean, if somebody in the community is a schizophrenic, paranoid schizophrenic, they are much more likely to be the victim of crime than the perpetrator of crime. I think a lot of people, lay people, when they hear paranoid schizophrenic, they think of somebody that's going to be a danger and stuff like that. It's just not the case most of the time. But when I started doing the job, they would have, in terms of pastoral care, in terms of community psychiatric nurses visiting them and that kind of thing, they get fairly regular visits and fairly sort of in-depth visits. But toward the end, I had people who would get a visit from a nurse once every 2 months, maybe. And I always say that mental illness isn't a stasis, it's not a static state. My own mental health has gone through ups and downs. There's been times when it's been so bad I've not been able to work. There's been other times when I've not needed even medication and I've felt fine. So it's the same with the people I was dealing with. It can be up and down, and if they're not getting that ongoing care, how do you know when they're struggling? And often it's the fire alarm again. The only way the mental health services knew that one of their clients was struggling was because the behaviour sort of was going off the rails. Like one of my tenants who would deal with it by singing Kylie songs very loudly at sort of 3 a.m. to ward off the noises in his head and so on. So I think even if you're a Kylie fan, that's going to be annoying after a while. But it was things like that where I would almost be the person phoning up mental health team going, your guy, oh yeah, well yeah, he's not doing too well because he's doing X, Y and Z, and that's how they find out, which it kind of worked, and you make do amend, but in a better funded society that would have been noticed far sooner. And it would have been, because often when people who are struggling with a mental illness or behaving antisocially as a result are really suffering, and that's their way of coping, so they're going through a nightmare, not to mention the neighbours around who are having to listen to it and experience it. Well, so it's just a way of reducing that suffering to catch it earlier.
Brilliant. Really good. So Nick, perhaps you want to just finish off with a little bit more. A little bit more of a flavour of perhaps some of the.
Well, if I've got one here, which is a pretty sort of standard day in the life of an ASB officer and the kind of stuff I dealt with. Let me see if I can just find it. So, this is an example I use in the book about when you sort of are trying to gather evidence.
Sure.
So, I recently had a pretty standard complaint about Trevor, a man who lived in a block of flats who was making a lot of noise and smoking copious amounts of cannabis, the smell of which was drifting into neighbouring properties. A surprising percentage of people think that if they can smell cannabis, they can get high from it, which is like assuming you can get drunk from licking an alcoholic. Nevertheless, I interviewed Trevor about the complaints we'd received, and he categorically denied ever behaving in such a manner. He was shocked that anyone could accuse him of such behaviour, and could only assume that the neighbours in question were jealous of him for some unspecified reason, and this was why they were stating such baseless and pernicious falsehoods. That was the spirit of his denial, if not the verbatim substance of it, which contained rather more references to miserable old bitches and so on. So a few days later I was walking past his block of flats, and I heard the unmistakable dull bass thud of music being played too loud. I went upstairs and knocked on Trevor's door. As he answered the door, I was overpowered by a wave of skunk, which smells like unwashed armpit, which is probably how it gets its name. Also present were 90-odd decibels of Sean Paul, his 2002 hit Get Busy, which recommended I get both jiggy and crunked up, neither of which I had any intention of doing, not at 11 a.m. on a Wednesday, certainly. 90-odd decibels of Sean Paul is at least 88 decibels too many, I feel. I asked Trevor how it was that people complained he was being noisy and he smoked weed. He denied being noisy and smoking weed, and yet here we were, with Trevor irrefutably being noisy in a flat that stank of weed. Yeah, well, it's a coincidence. It's the first time I've done this, he said. Bearing in mind the odds of such a thing happening, I bought a lottery ticket on my way home, on my way back to the office, to write Trevor his warning letter.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks for coming, and thanks for being such a good sport. The audience are going to ask you some questions.
We can see all the way to the back there.
That's right. I also would just like to say thank you to the astonishing response that we got today on social media for as a result of the break-in and the mess that we've had to clear up and deal with today. So thank you very much to everybody who has sent their good thoughts and been very generous to us today. Thank you. And
No, it's been a real pleasure. Thanks very much.
It was great, and good luck with the book, because it's an eye-opening read.
Cool.
All right.